This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and today is Friday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at First Strike. First Strike is an evergreen keyword ability, which means we see a significant amount of it in every single set. It is one of Magic's original keywords, making its debut in Alpha. A creature with First Strike does its combat damage before creatures without First Strike. This makes it extra hard for non-First Strike creatures to win in combat against creatures who have the keyword. Obviously, this means creatures with First Strike make for great attackers and blockers. This is actually the second time I've done First Strike, with the original MTG Top 10 on First Strike coming out back in 2018. Now that it's been 5 years, the list has changed quite a lot. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have or grant First Strike. In all, 627 cards were eligible, and in this video we'll take a look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. We'll actually look at a few more cards than that too, because like in other videos when I revisit an old MTG Top 10, I'll also talk about the cards that were on the list last time but didn't make it this time. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Alright, let's begin with a look at the 4 cards that were on the list in 2018, but didn't make it this time. Starting with Fiend Slayer Paladin, which came in at number 10 last time. In addition to First Strike, this 3-mana 2/2 also has lifelink, and can't be targeted by black or red spells your opponents control. Those are generally the 2 best colors for removal, especially cheap removal, so being immune to it is a big deal, and its 2 keywords make it quite formidable in combat. In Standard, it was played in a variety of white aggro decks, including Bant Hexproof, a deck that specialized in putting auras on hard-to-kill creatures, and Fiend Slayer Paladin definitely fit the bill there. For a long time, Standard was the only format where the Paladin had been played, but it has recently started to show up in Pioneer Boros aggro deck sideboards, which led to it gaining 2 points since 2018. Unfortunately for the Paladin, that was nowhere near enough to stay on the list, as the new number 10 card on it has 47 points, more than double what the Paladin has. Next, there's Blade Splicer, which came in at number 9 last time. The Splicer is a 3-mana 1/1 that makes a 3/3 golem creature token when it enters the battlefield, and it also grants all golems First Strike. In Standard, it was mostly played in green-white aggro decks as well as Birthing Pod, where it was nice to be able to sacrifice the Splicer to the pod and get another creature while still holding on to the golem. In Modern, it's mostly been played in Hate Bear, but it doesn't have any points since 2018, so it's no surprise it couldn't hold on to a spot on the list. Next, there's Rune Chanters Pike, which came in at number 8 last time. The Pike buffs the equipped creature 1 power for each instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and because First Strike comes along for the ride, it's often pretty much impossible to block the creature this is attached to. Which is tough because that creature is usually also hitting really hard. It gained all of its points in Standard, where it was played in aggressive spell-heavy decks like Delver of Secrets decks. That deck also used Invisible Stalker, and a Stalker attacking with a Rune Chanter's Pike attached to it makes you feel pretty helpless. Rune Chanter's Pike hasn't gained any points though since 2013. Lastly, there's Knight of the White Orchid, which came in at number 7 last time. The Knight is a 2-mana 2/2 with First Strike, and when it enters the battlefield, if your opponent has more lands than you get to search up a plains and put it on the battlefield tapped. When timed correctly, this can be a white creature that ramps your mana, which is great, especially because your fail case is still an efficient First Strike creature. The Knight was lucky enough to have 2 separate runs through Standard, and it took advantage of both. Unsurprisingly, in both cases, it was largely played in white aggro decks. The Knight also benefited from the creation of Pioneer in 2019, giving it another format where it can play an important role in white aggro decks. The Knight has gained 7 points since 2018, all of them in Pioneer, but it wasn't quite enough to make the list. Alright, now that we've covered the cards that didn't make it this time, let's take a look at the list proper. At number 9, it is Brutal Kathar, which didn't exist back in 2018, since it was only printed in 2021. During the day, he enters the battlefield as a pretty typical Banisher Priest type creature. In other words, when he enters the battlefield, he exiles a creature until he leaves the battlefield. That makes for a great removal spell, but not the best attacker. At night, he's a 3/3 with First Strike and Ward, at which point he is much more capable of turning sideways. The Day-Night transformation also has an interesting additional effect here, because every time it transforms into the Kathar, it can exile something else, so it can potentially take out multiple creatures. The Kathar has been heavily played in white aggro decks in Standard, Historic, and Pioneer, and while it doesn't have any points just yet in Modern and Legacy, it is seeing some play in those formats too, and it isn't out of the question that this powerful werewolf puts up some top 8s in those formats in the future. It's going to keep on gaining points, and it's likely to move up this list. At number 9, it is Boros Reckoner, which has fallen 4 spots since 2018. The Reckoner is a 3-mana 3/3 that can gain First Strike for a red-white hybrid mana. While First Strike is nice, it is the Reckoner's other ability that makes the card really powerful. Anytime it gets damaged, it deals that much damage to any target. That means if your opponent wants to trade for it, you're probably going to be able to get a 2-for-1, since the Reckoner can do at least 3 damage to something else. It gained all of its points in block and standard, and mostly in red aggro decks. One of the nastier things people could do in that format was run Blasphemous Act alongside the Reckoner, since it would usually wipe the board and do 13 to your opponent, which isn't usually something they could survive. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of standard, and if I revisit this list in a few years, it probably won't be on it anymore. At number 8, it is Lyra Dawnbringer, who was unranked last time. While she existed back in 2018, she'd only been around for a few months, and her 20 points at the time weren't enough to crack the list, but now she has more than enough. Anyway, in addition to having impressive stats and keywords, including First Strike, Lyra is also an Angel Lord. Large flying creatures with lifelink and First Strike tend to be a real problem. They make it pretty impossible to race, because every time they hit an opponent, it creates a gap of 10 life between you and your opponent. On top of that, because she has First Strike, that means she can even hang back and block super effectively in a pinch too. It was played primarily in aggressive decks in Standard, like Vehicles, Boros Aggro, and even the Boros Angels deck, which got maximum value out of Lyra Dawnbringer. In Pioneer, she's been played in blue-white control, and she's been played in Modern too, primarily in the sideboard of blue-white control. Against more aggressive opponents who don't play much removal that can deal with a 5/5, Lyra Dawnbringer can be pretty insurmountable. She's likely to gain more points going forward, but she isn't doing it at such a high rate that her spot on the list is guaranteed if I revisit it in a few years. At number 7, it is Toolcraft Exemplar, which has dropped 4 spots since 2018. This dwarf was an amazing 1-drop in Standard. If you have an artifact, he's a 1-mana 3/2, and if you have 3 in play, he adds First Strike to the mix. The Exemplar was played a lot in Standard between 2016 and 2018. Vehicles and artifacts in general were a big part of that Standard format, and as a result, the Exemplar was well suited to these artifact-heavy aggro decks, where it was virtually always a 1-mana 3/2 with First Strike. It has been idle ever since rotating out of Standard, and it hasn't gained any points since 2018, so it's in danger of falling off of the list in the coming years. At number 6, it is the Wandering Emperor, which was unranked in 2018 because she wasn't around back then, as she was only printed in 2022. This powerful planeswalker comes with several impressive abilities. Her +1 is what gets her on the list, because it puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature and gives it First Strike until end of turn. She also has a -1 that makes a Samurai, and a -2 that exiles a tapped creature. While these abilities would all be fairly good in a vacuum, the Emperor gets a massive boost out of the fact that she has Flash, and if she entered the battlefield on a turn, she can use her loyalty abilities at instant speed. The counter and First Strike make for a pretty sweet combat trick that will help a whole lot of creatures win combat, while her -2 can remove a problematic attacker before it hits you, and her -1 can add a blocker to the board. The fact she has Flash also makes her a great planeswalker for control decks, since they can leave their mana up to use removal or counter magic if they need to, and then still add a very scary planeswalker to the board if their other cards aren't needed. But she's also pretty good in aggressive decks, since she can buff your creatures and help you go wide. Her power, and the fact that she's great in such a wide variety of decks, has allowed the Wandering Emperor to quickly impact several formats, including Standard, Alchemy, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. She's in a great spot thanks to this multi-format success, and is a pretty good candidate to rapidly move up the list going forward. At number 5, it is Goblin Chain Whirler, which is a newcomer to the list. The Chain Whirler is from the same set as Lyra Dawnbringer, Dominaria, so while it existed in 2018, it hadn't been around long, and it only had 19 points, which wasn't quite enough to crack the list back then. However, it has gained 44 points over the last several years, which was good enough for it to make the top half of the list this time. The Whirler is a 3-mana 3/3 with First Strike that does 1 damage to the opponent. That's already a card worth looking at in a lot of aggro decks, but the ability gets even better than that because it also does 1 damage to all of your opponent's creatures and planeswalkers. So it can often come down and destroy some small creatures while also lowering the loyalty of a planeswalker. Because of its somewhat tricky mana cost, the Chain Whirler was almost exclusively played in mono-red aggro decks in both Standard and Pioneer, and it's gained points in Goblin decks in Historic, Modern, and Legacy. Thanks to its multi-format success, Goblin Chain Whirler is well positioned to continue to gain points in the future. At number 4, it is Thalia, Heretic Kathar, who has moved up 2 spots since 2018. Thalia is a pretty classic white hate creature, since she brings good stats to the table and a disruptive effect. As a 3-mana 3/2 with First Strike, she is an effective attacker, and making opposing creatures and non-basic lands into the battlefield tapped is no joke either. It will make it a lot harder for your opponent to block, while obviously also disrupting their mana. She's been played in multiple formats and in aggro decks in all of them, which makes sense, because making new creatures incapable of blocking really enables you to pile on extra damage in a hurry. In Standard, she was played in Bant Collected Company, Azorius Aggro, and the various vehicle decks alongside Toolcraft Exemplar. In Pioneer, she sees play in White Weenie decks, and in Modern, she has points in Human and Hate Bear decks, and she even sees play in the Eternal formats where she's played in Death and Taxes and Eldrazi Aggro. She's likely to keep gaining points in the future. At number 3, it is Kari Zev's Skyship Raider, who held on to her number 3 slot. In addition to First Strike, she also has Menace, making her even harder to block. First Strike and Menace combine quite nicely too in the early game. Obviously, your opponent needs at least 2 creatures to block her effectively, but they also need to have a creature with more than 1 toughness, otherwise she's likely to kill one of the blockers and survive to attack again, and that's especially nice since she brings her friend Ragavan along every time she attacks. All of this allows her to chip in for a ton of damage quickly, especially if you have cheap removal to get things out of the way. She saw a lot of play in Standard mono-red aggro decks, but went idle for a while after she rotated out of the format, but she benefited from the creation of the Pioneer format in 2019, where she's gained all of her points over the last several years. Just like in Standard, she's played in mono-red aggro decks in Pioneer. At number 2, it is Bane Slayer Angel, which has moved up 2 spots since 2018. She's pretty similar to Lyra Dawnbringer. She trades in the Angel Lord upside for protection from dragons and demons, and she isn't legendary, so you can have more than one of her in play. Like Lyra, Baneslayer provides a frightening finisher that will be able to put the game out of reach for many opponents with just one swing. The Angel was part of the Cobblade deck that dominated Standard in 2011, and didn't see a ton of play after various bannings weakened the deck. During the heyday of Cobblade, though, she was in such high demand that she was jokingly referred to as Wallet Slayer Angel because she demanded such a high price. She also picked up some points in Extended, Zoo, and Blue-White control decks. In Modern, the Angel has primarily been featured in sideboards and roles very similar to Lyra Dawnbringer. Baneslayer Angel received a reprint in Core Set 2021, and this was pretty important because it not only made her legal in Standard again, it also meant she was legal in Pioneer, something else she has taken advantage of, appearing in Blue-White control decks in the format. She's likely to get more points in the future, but I think there's a good chance she eventually gets passed by cards like Thalia, Heretic Kathar, and the Wandering Emperor, who are seeing more consistent play in more formats. And at number 1, it is Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, the second Thalia to make the list. She maintained her number 1 spot on the list by gaining an impressive 82 points over the last several years. That's more than any other card on the list, so she's actually extended her lead. This Thalia is potentially the game's greatest hate bear. In other words, she's a 2-drop, 2-power creature that is not only efficient, she also makes the game harder for your opponent. She charges attacks of 1 additional mana for any non-creature spell, and that's pretty powerful, especially when attached to such an efficient creature. Even just making it so your opponent basically has to pay 2 or more mana to kill her, or making them take 1 more turn to cast their board sweeper, can really be the difference between winning and losing if you're an aggro deck. In Block and Standard, she was primarily featured in straightforward aggro decks. She also recently received a reprint in Innistrad Crimson Vow, and that has resulted in her gaining many more points in the format. In Modern, there's an entire deck simply called Hate Bears because it plays a bunch of creatures like Thalia. In addition to those Hate Bear decks, Thalia has also been played in Birthing Pod, Zoo, and Humans. She's also played in Legacy, Death, and Taxes. Thalia looks likely to continue to see a lot of play in both Modern and Legacy, and she stands a very good chance of holding on to her number 1 spot on the list for the foreseeable future. So those are the 10 cards with First Strike that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to see future videos and you're not already subscribed, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.